new discoveries here at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre happened during a recent restoration around the tomb of Jesus.
The ground-penetrating radar screen went black, then flashed a shape that stopped the entire excavation team cold.
Our tour guide told us that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre new archaeological excavations at the site had revealed.
They were scanning for structural weaknesses, but the machine had picked up something else entirely. A perfect rectangular void hidden beneath the bedrock.
It was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there.
This wasn't supposed to be there. As the team lowered a micro camera into the darkness, the air in the room shifted from scientific curiosity to absolute shock. They were looking at a pristine, first-century installation that had been erased from history books. And resting on a stone bench inside were microscopic traces that should have decayed centuries ago. The silent void beneath. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is perhaps the most protected, argued over, and carefully watched building on the face of the earth. For centuries, it has stood as a fortress of tradition, guarded by competing religious communities that rarely agree on anything. The air inside is thick with incense and the weight of history, but beneath the feet of the pilgrims, there was always a mystery waiting to be solved. Scientists and historians were never meant to investigate the ground beneath the traditional tomb of Jesus. The rules were simple. Look, pray, but do not touch. However, time has a way of breaking even the strictest rules. In 2022, a routine structural check exposed a hidden danger that could not be ignored. The marble floor surrounding the edicule, the shrine that encloses the tomb, was beginning to shift. It wasn't just old age, the ground was sinking. Structural engineers warned that if they didn't act, the entire shrine could collapse into the earth. This emergency forced the hands of the Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Armenian custodians. They had to make a decision that terrified them. They had to open the floor. But here is the catch. What they uncovered beneath that marble did not match any record, any expectation, or any approved history. It shocked the specialists who saw it first and pushed church authorities into an immediate lockdown. The restoration that began as a safety measure quickly turned into an archaeological thriller. As the workers lifted the heavy paving stones, they weren't just fixing a foundation, they were opening a door into a past that many thought had been lost forever. The silence in the basilica was heavy as the first layer of soil was exposed. The team knew they were trespassing on sacred ground, but they had no idea they were standing directly on top of a secret that had been sealed for nearly 2,000 years. The atmosphere inside the church shifted instantly. Technicians worked in total silence, fully aware that they were entering a space that had been sealed to outsiders for generations. When archaeologists arrived, they were told their access would be incredibly limited. They would be allowed to examine only the area beneath the marble pavement close to the edicule. They had a narrow window of time, barely enough to scratch the surface, and strict boundaries. Even so, the opportunity was rare. Modern science had never studied the deeper layers under this part of the floor. The team moved cautiously as they prepared their equipment. They needed to avoid disturbing anything sacred while still gathering data that could stabilize the structure. Ground-penetrating radar was the first tool allowed into the space. The scanner hummed across the marble, sending electromagnetic signals deep into the layers below. The readings began to form patterns that surprised the technicians. The bedrock did not appear smooth or uniform as the blueprint suggested. It showed dips and rises that did not match the expected layout beneath a stable foundation. According to preliminary reports, some of the echoes hinted at cavities or pockets that had been untouched for centuries. No one wanted to jump to conclusions, but the scan suggested that hidden features lay below the visible floor. It is not that simple, though. The data was messy, confused by centuries of building and rebuilding, but the anomaly was there. Microarchaeology specialists prepared sampling instruments in case further investigation was approved. They had permission only to examine loose sediment and dust once the marble was lifted. Even that limited access offered a chance to study pollen, soil textures, and mineral deposits that might reveal the history of the ground beneath the shrine. When the first section of marble was finally removed, the team prepared themselves to see the usual repair material from past restorations. For centuries, the Holy Sepulchre had been patched, resurfaced, and reinforced. So finding modern mortar and construction debris would have made perfect sense. Basically, everyone expected to find trash and rubble. Instead, the moment the layer lifted, everyone stopped. Beneath the marble lay compacted soil that was far older than expected. It was dense, layered, and untouched by any recent work. The researchers understood immediately that this was not routine maintenance material. It was an ancient surface that had been sealed away under generations of rebuilding. What they had opened was not a repair zone. It was a direct doorway into the site's earliest history. And get this, as they dug deeper, the story of Jerusalem began to unravel in reverse. The team began removing the exposed layers carefully, expecting ordinary fill from different periods of repair. What they uncovered instead was a clear and orderly sequence of historical deposits. The topmost layer was easily recognized. Under the modern paving lay a 20th century leveling mortar used during earlier restoration work. It was a practical layer, but it showed how often the site had required attention. Beneath it emerged fragments of Byzantine paving from the 4th century. These stones came from the massive reconstruction ordered under Emperor Constantine and confirmed that a formal sanctuary stood here long before medieval builders arrived. But deeper down, the tone changed. The next layer carried a heavier history. Crews reached compacted rubble associated with a 2nd century Roman project. Reports linked this debris to Emperor Hadrian's effort to impose a pagan temple at the site to erase the Christian memory. The fill was dense and uniform, as if earlier structures had been flattened deliberately before new construction began. For many on the team, this matched expected historical accounts. It was a violent layer full of broken stone and the intent to destroy. The real crazy part is what emerged below the Roman destruction. The soil shifted from construction debris to unmistakable quarry material. Fine dust, stone chips, and packing sediment pointed to active limestone extraction in the 1st century. Several pottery fragments found in this layer matched forms widely dated to the period before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. According to early analysis, this suggested the ground had been part of a working quarry rather than a simple open area. Ground-penetrating radar reinforced the finding. The subsurface layout sloped in a pattern consistent with quarry cuts documented elsewhere in Jerusalem. Geophysical specialists reported that the shape of the deposits reflected deliberate stone removal rather than natural erosion. For the first time, the area beneath the church began to resemble an industrial zone from early Jerusalem. It forces you to wonder how they took all these huge blocks and how they got them up to the surface in these ancient times with no machinery, no motors, only by human force. The sheer physical effort etched into the landscape was staggering. But here is the deal with the soil chemistry. It confirmed the order of events perfectly. Each cultural layer carried distinct mineral and organic signatures that had not mixed. This meant the site had remained stable for centuries, allowing the layers to survive in place. A final detail deepened the significance. The boundaries revealed by the radar matched reconstructions of 1st century city limits. Some researchers believe this placement supports claims that the burial area originally lay outside the ancient walls. The idea remains debated, but it changed the direction of the investigation. With the historical layers identified, archaeologists turned to the soil beneath the Roman destruction layer. What they found there was unexpected and far more alive than stone. The garden and the bench. When the team reached the layer beneath the Roman debris, they expected more quarry dust and broken stone. It would have been logical. Instead, they uncovered pockets of dark, enriched soil that did not belong in a quarry at all. The texture and color were completely different from the rocky material above it. This immediately raised questions because such soil appears only when people place garden earth intentionally in a location where nothing would grow on its own. It was a deliberate attempt to create life in a place of death. The first major clue came from pollen analysis. The lab identified preserved grains from olive and grape plants. These were not wild species blown in by the wind. They were the same plants that households in 1st century Jerusalem commonly cultivated in small, managed gardens. According to several researchers, this was an important detail because Gospel accounts specifically mentioned that the tomb was located inside a garden. The presence of cultivated plant pollen suggested that this area was not an abandoned quarry at that time. It had been an active garden space maintained by someone who lived nearby, and that is putting it lightly. The second major clue appeared when the soil was removed and the bedrock underneath became visible. Cut into the stone were shallow plant beds arranged in a simple, organized pattern. They were too intentional to be natural depressions. According to preliminary notes, these beds matched the layout of small garden plots often found near first-century Jewish tombs where families tended plants during visits. This pattern implied regular personal activity and suggested that the garden was part of a burial complex rather than a public field. These two findings changed the direction of the investigation completely. The soil proved that the ground above the next layer had been a maintained garden during the first century. The carved planting beds showed that someone cared for the space in a structured way. Together, they raised an unavoidable question. If a garden existed here at that exact time, what stood beneath it? The next excavation layer delivered the answer, and it was undeniable. The first exposed surface was flat and shaped with deliberate precision. It was not a patch of natural stone or a rough extraction scar. It was a cut ledge. The moment the light fell on it, several archaeologists stepped forward, their hearts racing. The ledge sat at a consistent height with a smooth surface that showed controlled workmanship. It was a burial bench, the same kind used in first-century Jewish tombs throughout Jerusalem. In that period, burial benches served a specific purpose. Families placed the body on the bench immediately after death for washing, preparation, and the application of spices. The bench here followed that pattern closely. Its height, its surface finish, and its overall form matched examples cataloged in known first-century tombs around the city. Nothing about it looked like a later addition. It belonged to the earliest stage of burial practice. As the trench widened, a second bench emerged beside the first. Soon after, a third came into view. All three carried the same chisel rhythm. The marks moved in controlled arcs that matched the work of trained stonecutters rather than general laborers. Basically, the benches formed a sequence that reflected planning rather than improvisation. According to field notes, their uniformity suggested that this chamber had been designed as part of a multi-person family tomb rather than a single burial. A new detail appeared when the team cleared rubble to the east. Beneath the debris was a narrow vertical shaft. The opening was small at first, but when the loose stone was removed, the feature became unmistakable. It was a coke, a long burial niche cut deep into the bedrock. These niches held the body after the initial preparation on the bench. The presence of both benches and a niche confirmed that the team was inside a complete burial system, not a partial structure or accidental cut. The workmanship gave more clarity. The tool marks that shaped the benches and the niche matched first-century carving techniques. The strike showed consistent pressure and angle. Conservators inspected the chamber for signs of medieval alteration or later intrusion, but none appeared. The stone surfaces were original and showed no evidence of being reworked in later centuries. But here is the catch that really puzzled them. On the west wall of the chamber, a niche had been started but never finished. The carving stopped abruptly halfway through the cut. Some researchers believe this may point to a sudden halt in construction, possibly caused by an unexpected event or a rushed burial timeline. The idea remains speculative, but the incomplete niche supports the impression of activity carried out under pressure. By the time the chamber was fully revealed, the conclusion was clear. The garden above had not been symbolic or decorative. It had been part of a real first-century burial complex. The layout aligned with what the earliest accounts describe, and it suggested that the investigation was moving closer to its most critical layer. But the real drama was just beginning. The next discovery came from inside the chamber itself, and it changed the tone of the entire excavation from architectural to forensic. The moment the benches and the niche were fully documented, the next step was to examine the chamber floor and the small crevices carved into the stone. The tomb had been sealed beneath later construction for centuries, so the chances of any biological material surviving seemed extremely low. Even so, the technicians prepared their sample instruments carefully. They wanted to be certain that nothing was overlooked. The first unusual detail appeared when a narrow groove between two benches was vacuumed with a micro-extraction tube. At the bottom of the groove, trapped against the stone, was a cluster of tiny fibers. They were faint, nearly invisible, but they held a texture that did not match mineral dust. When the fibers were transferred into a sealed vial, one of the specialists paused. The material did not crumble like plant matter or sweep away like environmental debris. It clung to the tool in a way that suggested a woven origin. Inside the lab, the fibers were examined under high-powered magnification. The images revealed a clear weave pattern far finer than anything caused by natural processes. According to the first technical report, the fibers had the twisted structure of ancient linen. This created an immediate debate. Linen is fragile and degrades quickly in open environments. Finding it intact in any form inside a chamber this old was unexpected. The team double-checked the instruments to rule out contamination. The equipment tested clean. So they dug deeper. More samples were taken from the edges of the benches. In two separate spots, additional fibers appeared. They were similar in size and structure, and again they showed the same woven characteristics. According to the analysts, the fibers were too consistent to be accidental or intrusive. Something textile-related had once rested on the stone surface. If this was burial linen, then the benches had not only been carved for preparation, but had actually been used. One sample carried an even stronger clue. Embedded within a fragment was a microscopic residue that indicated contact with oils, not modern oils, but ancient ones. The signature resembled the chemical breakdown pattern associated with ancient burial ointments. Several researchers warned that the finding was still preliminary. They emphasized that further validation was needed. Even so, the lab noted that linen soaked with aromatic preparations was a known part of first-century Jewish burial rites. The possibility was difficult to ignore. The discovery carried emotional weight. The benches already proved the tomb was real. The niche showed that the structure followed established burial practice, but the fibers pushed the investigation beyond architecture. They hinted at an actual body that had once been prepared on these stones. For the first time, the evidence pointed to human presence rather than symbolic tradition. The team moved forward with new caution. If textile fragments had survived inside this chamber, then deeper biological traces might still be preserved. And those traces, if they existed, would appear in the sealed space that the radar had already identified below. A sealed chamber. The team had already exposed first-century tomb benches and traces of burial linen in the outer peripheries of the site. That alone would have been the discovery of a lifetime, a career-defining validation of the site's antiquity. But none of that compared to what waited beneath the limestone slab believed to mark the traditional location of Jesus' burial. It was late in the evening when the site was cleared of pilgrims and clergy, leaving only the hum of the ventilation units and the quiet shuffling of the technicians. Ground-penetrating radar specialists began their passes expecting the predictable density of ordinary bedrock. For several minutes, the reading stayed flat, showing the chaotic but solid returns typical of the Jerusalem subsurface. Then, as the sensor array crossed the central axis of the edicule, the monitor produced a shape no one expected. A clean rectangular void sat directly beneath the slab. The data did not show the jagged organic lines of a natural cavern or a sinkhole. It had even edges, right angles, and a consistent depth. It looked sealed and intentional, a pocket of negative space carved by human hands. The technicians, fearing a glitch in the equipment or interference from the heavy masonry above, recalibrated the sensors. They repeated the scan, moving slower this time, filtering out the surface noise. The void appeared again, sharper than before. According to internal notes, the size matched a small room, an antechamber, or a distinct burial cell. Yet no historical map, no Crusader chronicle, and no architectural diagram from the last millennium mentioned anything beneath this point. If a chamber existed here, it had been hidden for nearly 2,000 years, surviving the destruction of the Roman temple, the construction of the Constantinian basilica, and the fires that had ravaged the structure over the centuries. Because the slab could not be removed, such an act would violate centuries of religious protocol and structural stability. The team searched for the smallest possible entry point. They scoured the perimeter of the bedding stone, looking for imperfections in the mortar or the rock itself. Finally, a natural fissure was located running along the base of the bedding stone, obscured by centuries of candle wax and dust. After long discussion regarding the structural risks, a fiber optic micro camera was guided into the opening. The cable snaked through the darkness, scraping against rough stone. On the control monitor, the screen went black, then flickered with static. As the LED illuminator flared to life, the image focused. The reaction inside the room was immediate. The chamber was intact. It was not filled with rubble or collapsed debris, as many had feared. The floor was covered in a layer of undisturbed dust, a pale, fine powder that settles only over millennia of absolute stillness. The walls showed no signs of later repairs, no Crusader crosses carved into the plaster, no Ottoman structural reinforcements. Nothing inside had been touched. It was a time capsule, sealed hermetically by the layers of stone above. The camera moved slowly toward the center, guided by the trembling hand of the operator. A flat limestone bench stood in the room, hewn directly from the living rock. It carried simple carved lines used in first-century burial preparation, drainage channels and headrests typical of the Second Temple period. These were not Christian symbols from later centuries. There were no inscriptions of fish, anchors, or chai rows. They matched the earliest phase of Jewish burial practice, specifically the style used by wealthy families in Jerusalem around the turn of the era. The edges of the bench were sharp rather than worn, suggesting the surface had been used briefly and then sealed away. It lacked the smooth, eroded patina of surfaces that have been touched by thousands of pilgrims. Through the small opening, the team extracted trace samples from the bench using vacuum tubing, a delicate operation that took hours to ensure no external contaminants entered the space. Laboratory reports later confirmed microscopic fibers consistent with ancient linen. They were the same type of fibers previously found in the upper tomb benches, but here they were concentrated in a single place. The weave pattern was distinctive, a simple Z-twist consistent with the textiles of the Levant during the Roman occupation, distinct from the imported textiles of later eras. According to several specialists, the distribution of the fibers indicated that a body wrapped in linen had once rested on the stone. The claim was cautious but serious. It suggested that this was not merely a memorial cenotaph constructed to mark a holy spot, but a functional tomb that had seen use. As the camera panned further, a small carved niche in the wall added another layer of complexity. It matched the shape of short-term preparation spaces used during first-century burial rituals, where aromatic oils or lamps might be placed. The niche was empty except for a faint patch of discoloration on the stone, a circular stain that stood out against the pale limestone. It looked as if an object or vessel, perhaps a jar of ointment or a clay lamp, had once sat there before the chamber was sealed, leaving a chemical shadow in the rock. Mineral buildup on the walls provided the final and perhaps most critical confirmation. Geochemical readings showed the crust, a calcified layer known as sinter, had formed in a closed environment. The isotopic signature of the minerals indicated stable humidity and temperature, unaffected by the fluctuating atmosphere of the church above. There were no signs of movement, cracks, or later entry. If the analysis was correct, the chamber had been sealed soon after the 1st century and had never been opened since. This meant that whatever historical record lay inside had not been corrupted by the piety or politics of the intervening ages. The implications split the team instantly. The silence of the excavation site was replaced by the low, urgent murmur of debate. Some researchers argued that the chamber fit early descriptions of the original burial place of Jesus before later construction reshaped the site. They pointed to the alignment, the style of the masonry, and the presence of the linen dust as a convergence of evidence that was statistically impossible to ignore. They argued that the traditional site was not merely a tradition, but a memory preserved by architecture. Others insisted the evidence was not enough to make a direct identification. They urged a stance of aggressive neutrality. According to internal accounts, the debates became tense, fueled by exhaustion and the sheer weight of what they were looking at. A few scholars argued that if the chamber truly dated to the 1st century and held signs of a wrapped body, placed briefly and then removed, it matched a timeline recorded in the Gospels with unnerving precision. They contended that archaeology rarely provides names, but it provides context, and this context was singular. Opponents countered that this interpretation was premature and carried enormous consequences. They warned that connecting the find directly to Jesus would be scientifically irresponsible without an inscription. They feared that the moment word of the chamber spread beyond the immediate team, the quiet of the excavation would collapse. They were right. Scientific committees, religious authorities, and international institutions demanded access. Heated exchanges broke out over ownership, interpretation, and control. Who owned the dust in that room? The church, the state, the scientific community? And with that, the conflict surrounding the discovery began. The moment news of the sealed chamber reached academic circles, the reaction was immediate and intense. Senior archaeologists were the first to respond, and many of them urged caution. They argued that the evidence, while extraordinary, required more verification before anyone tried to connect it to a specific historical figure. Jerusalem is honeycombed with tombs. Finding one from the 1st century is rare, but not impossible. According to some of these scholars, the chamber could represent an elite 1st century burial space for a different family, preserved by chance beneath the church. They argued that without an ossuary or an inscription, the linen in the bench proved only period and custom, not identity. Their calls for restraint were direct, rooted in a discipline that has been burned before by sensationalism, but their uncertainty only fueled public fascination. Religious custodians reacted with concern of a different kind. For the communities that have guarded the Holy Sepulchre for centuries, the site is not a data point, it is the center of the world. They feared that unrestricted access would lead to misinterpretation or sensational claims that could undermine the theology of the resurrection or disrupt the delicate status quo of the church. Several custodians insisted that only authorized specialists should examine the chamber, and they demanded limited entry until the evidence could be handled with proper oversight. They emphasized the sacred nature of the location and warned that careless presentation could cause confusion among believers. Their requests created tension with scientific teams who viewed the site as a puzzle to be solved, not a mystery to be venerated. Historians who specialize in early Christianity took a firmer, more curious position. Many believed the discoveries supported traditions that had been dismissed by modern skeptics. For decades, a prevailing academic theory suggested that the location of the tomb was largely a later invention of the Constantine era. But this chamber changed the calculus. According to several early Christian historians, the chamber aligned closely with descriptions preserved in the earliest sources, texts that described a new tomb cut into rock located in a garden setting. They argued that the physical evidence restored credibility to accounts that had long been treated as symbolic by a portion of the academic world. Their statements circulated widely, appearing in journals and symposiums, adding fuel to the debate. Material scientists added another layer, providing the hard data that anchored the speculation. They pointed to the composition of the sealing minerals inside the chamber. According to lab reports, the mineral crust showed a pattern consistent with 1st century formation, a geologic clock that had stopped ticking 2,000 years ago. They emphasized that no later disturbance could be detected, no soot from Byzantine lamps, no pollen from medieval crops. This supported the idea that the chamber had remained closed since antiquity. Their findings strengthened the argument that the chamber was genuinely ancient, guarding its secrets through wars, earthquakes, and the rise and fall of empires. But what does this all mean for us today? It is easy to get lost in the chemical analysis, the debate over linen weave patterns, and the Hertz frequencies of radar scans. It is easy to view this as a purely academic exercise. But step back for a second. We are talking about a room that was sealed when the Roman Empire was at its height, when Pontius Pilate governed Judea, and when the history of the West was about to pivot on a single event. We are talking about a room that contains dust and fibers from a burial that changed the course of human history. Are we missing a key detail simply because we haven't looked deep enough? Hit that like button if you love archaeology and subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest secrets.